Chuck Norris, the man whose name was practically a synonym for toughness, decided it was time to take a break. For years he'd been in the spotlight, fighting bad guys on screen, telling jokes that became internet legends, and even inspiring stories about his superhuman abilities. But all that fame came with a downside. No matter where he went, people recognized him. Whether he was grabbing coffee or walking through an airport, there was always someone asking for a photo, an autograph, or just staring in awe. This time, Chuck wanted something different, a real vacation away from the constant attention. So he came up with a plan. If he couldn't escape the public eye by being himself, why not try blending in? Chuck thought long and hard about how to pull off this undercover mission. He rummaged through his closet looking for clothes that would make him look like an ordinary guy. Out went the flashy jackets and polished cowboy boots. Instead, he picked out a plain flannel shirt, faded blue jeans, and a simple baseball cap. To complete the transformation, he stopped by a local thrift store and bought a pair of scuffed-up work boots. They weren't exactly stylish, but they fit the part perfectly. A regular Joe nobody would give a second glance. Feeling confident in his new look, Chuck hopped into his car and drove to one of Los Angeles's most luxurious hotels. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find someone dressed so casually, but that was the point. He figured if he could pass as a guest here, he could do it anywhere. As he approached the grand entrance, he kept his head down, careful not to make eye contact with anyone. The bellhop opened the door for him, glancing briefly at his outfit but not saying a word. So far, so good. Inside, the lobby buzzed with activity. Wealthy tourists chatted near the fountain, business people typed furiously on their laptops, and couples strolled hand in hand toward the elevators. Chuck adjusted the brim of his cap, making sure it shaded his face enough to avoid recognition. He walked straight to the front desk, where a young receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "Checking in?" she asked without looking up from her computer screen. "Yeah," Chuck replied in a quiet voice, sliding his ID across the counter. She scanned it quickly, handed him his room key card, and sent him on his way without so much as a double take. For a moment, Chuck felt triumphant. His disguise worked. No fanfare, no awkward questions, just a smooth check-in like any other guest. But as he turned toward the elevators, he noticed two security guards standing nearby. One of them nudged the other and tilted his chin slightly in Chuck's direction. Their eyes locked onto his feet, or more specifically, his boots. At first, Chuck didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just doing their jobs, keeping an eye on everyone who came and went. But then he saw the subtle smirk on one guard's face. It was the kind of look that said, "What's this guy doing here?" Suddenly, Chuck felt uneasy. Those boots, which he had chosen to help him blend in, now seemed to stick out like a sore thumb. Had he made a mistake? Was his cover already blown? For the first time in years, Chuck Norris found himself unsure of what to do next. As Chuck stepped into the elevator, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The two security guards' glances lingered in his mind, especially the way one of them had smirked at his boots. It wasn't just curiosity. It felt like judgment. Chuck pressed the button for his floor and leaned casually against the wall, trying to appear relaxed. But inside, his thoughts were racing. He had spent decades building a reputation as someone who commanded respect, whether it was on screen or in real life. Now here he was, reduced to feeling self-conscious because of a pair of old boots. The elevator doors began to close when suddenly, one of the guards slid in just before they shut completely. Chuck tensed slightly but kept his composure. The guard stood near the control panel, arms crossed, and gave him another once-over. This time there was no mistaking it. The man's eyes were fixed on Chuck's feet. "You sure you're supposed to be here?" the guard asked, his tone gruff and direct. Chuck froze. Not because he was scared, after all, this was Chuck Norris, but because he hadn't expected anyone to question him so boldly. In his line of work, people usually assumed he belonged wherever he showed up. Fame had its perks, and one of them was never having to explain himself. But now, standing in this elevator with scuffed-up boots and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, Chuck realized how much things had changed. For once, his name didn't carry any weight. All anyone saw was a man in plain clothes wearing worn-out footwear. For a brief moment, Chuck considered dropping his disguise right then and there. He could introduce himself, flash that signature grin, and watch the guard's expression shift, from suspicion to disbelief. But something stopped him. Maybe it was pride or maybe it was curiosity. He wanted to see how far this little experiment would go, so instead of revealing his identity, he simply nodded and said, "Yeah, I'm a guest." The guard didn't look convinced. He muttered something under his breath about people thinking they can just walk in here looking like that before stepping out on the next floor. As the elevator continued upward, Chuck let out a slow breath. That encounter had been more intense than he anticipated. He reminded himself that this was all part of the game. If he wanted to truly experience what it was like to blend in, he'd have to deal with moments like this. Still, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of irritation. Those boots weren't just some random choice. They were part of his plan. And now they were making him stick out in the worst possible way. When the elevator finally dinged and opened onto his floor, Chuck stepped out cautiously. The hallway was quiet, lined with plush carpeting and elegant lighting fixtures. He found his room and unlocked the door, slipping inside quickly. Once the door clicked shut behind him, he allowed himself a small laugh. The situation was almost funny in a bizarre sort of way. Who would have thought that Chuck Norris, the man whose roundhouse kicks were legendary, would be questioned over a pair of boots? But as he set his bag down and glanced at the mirror across the room, Chuck noticed something. His reflection looked different. Gone was the larger-than-life persona everyone knew. Instead, he saw an ordinary guy in simple clothes, someone who could easily fade into the background. That realization hit him harder than he expected. Maybe this undercover trip wasn't just about escaping fame, it was also about seeing the world through someone else's eyes. Being judged by his appearance, even if it was just for a few minutes, gave him a fresh perspective. Still, Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that the incident in the elevator wasn't over. Something told him those guards weren't going to let it drop. And sure enough, as he unpacked his things and settled into the room, he heard a soft knock at the door. Whoever was on the other side clearly wasn't done investigating the mysterious guest in the scuffed-up boots. Chuck hesitated for a moment before walking toward the door. He glanced through the peephole and saw exactly what he had feared. 2 security guards standing outside, their expressions serious and focused. One of them held a clipboard while the other crossed his arms, clearly prepared to get answers. Chuck took a deep breath and reminded himself to stay calm. After all, he wasn't doing anything wrong. Still, there was something unsettling about being questioned in your own hotel room, especially when you were just trying to enjoy a quiet vacation. He opened the door slightly, keeping the chain lock on as an extra precaution. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. The guard with the clipboard spoke first. "Sir, we need to verify your reservation. We've had some recent reports of suspicious activity, and we're checking all guests to ensure everything is in order." Chuck raised an eyebrow. Suspicious activity? What did that even mean? And why did they seem so fixated on him? "Sure," Chuck said, deciding to play along. He grabbed the key card from the table near the door and slid it through the gap. The guard examined it closely, comparing it to the information on his clipboard. Meanwhile, the second guard continued to stare at Chuck's boots, his expression unreadable. It was starting to feel like those boots were the real reason they were here. Chuck resisted the urge to roll his eyes. If only they knew who he really was, they'd probably be too embarrassed to say another word. After a few moments, the first guard handed the key card back. "Everything checks out," he admitted reluctantly. But instead of leaving, both men lingered, exchanging skeptical glances. Finally, the second guard spoke up. "Look, sir, no offense, but are you sure you're staying in this hotel? These rooms aren't cheap and—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at Chuck's outfit. "Well, let's just say most guests dress a little differently." Chuck felt a flicker of annoyance. He understood that hotels had rules and procedures, but this felt personal. They weren't just questioning his booking, they were judging him based on how he looked. For someone used to commanding respect without saying a word, it was a strange and humbling experience. Part of him wanted to laugh it off. After all, if these guards only knew who they were dealing with, they'd probably faint on the spot. But another part of him felt a pang of frustration. Why should anyone have to prove themselves just because of what they wear? Instead of snapping or revealing his identity, Chuck chose to respond with humor. "I guess I didn't get the memo about the dress code," he said with a small smile. "But don't worry, I promise I'll keep my boots off the furniture." The guards didn't laugh. In fact, their expressions grew even more serious. Clearly they weren't convinced. The first guard cleared his throat. "We'll need to confirm this with management. Please wait here until we return." As they turned to leave, Chuck closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long sigh. This situation was getting more complicated than he'd anticipated. At first, going undercover had seemed like a fun challenge, a chance to see what it was like to live life as an ordinary person. But now it felt like he was stuck in some kind of absurd comedy, all because of a pair of boots. Still, as frustrating as it was, Chuck couldn't deny that it was also intriguing. How often did someone like him get to experience life from this perspective? Most people assumed he was invincible, larger than life, almost mythical. Yet here he was, dealing with the same doubts and judgments everyone else faced. It made him realize how much power appearances held over people's perceptions. Those scuffed-up boots weren't just footwear. They were a symbol of how quickly someone could be dismissed without a second thought. A few minutes later, there was another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't just the guards. It was the hotel manager. Chuck braced himself for round two, unsure of what to expect next. Whatever happened, one thing was certain. This vacation was turning out to be far more eventful than he'd planned. When Chuck opened the door again, he was greeted by the sight of the hotel manager, a neatly dressed man in a crisp suit flanked by the same two security guards. The manager introduced himself with an air of forced politeness, though his furrowed brow and tight smile suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of Chuck's legitimacy. "Good evening, sir," he began, glancing briefly at Chuck's boots before meeting his eyes. "I'm Mr. Harris, the hotel manager. I understand there's been some confusion regarding your reservation. We'd like to clear this up as quickly as possible." Chuck nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He appreciated the effort to resolve the situation professionally, but the lingering stares from the guards were starting to grate on him. It was as if they expected him to suddenly pull out a fake ID or confess to sneaking into the hotel. "No problem," Chuck replied calmly. "I'm happy to help however I can." With that, he retrieved his wallet and handed over his driver's license, which still bore his real name. The manager examined it closely, his eyes widening slightly as he read the name aloud. "Charles Norris," he murmured under his breath. For a split second, recognition seemed to flicker across his face, but then he shook his head dismissively. Surely the Chuck Norris wouldn't be standing here in scuffed-up boots and a baseball cap. Convinced it must be a coincidence, he handed the ID back and turned to his clipboard. "Thank you, Mr. Norris. Everything appears to be in order. However, given the unusual circumstances, we need to confirm directly with our reservations team." Unusual circumstances? Chuck bit back a smirk. If only they knew how unusual things really were. Instead of arguing, he simply nodded again, playing along for now. While the manager stepped aside to make a phone call, the two guards lingered awkwardly in the doorway, their skepticism practically radiating off them. One of them muttered something about people trying to pass themselves off as guests, loud enough for Chuck to hear. He clenched his jaw but reminded himself that losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. Besides, deep down, he found the absurdity of the situation oddly amusing. After what felt like an eternity, the manager returned, looking more flustered than before. "Mr. Norris, everything checks out," he admitted reluctantly. "Your reservation is valid and you're fully authorized to stay in this hotel." Despite his words, his tone carried a hint of disbelief, as though he still suspected Chuck of pulling some elaborate prank. To make matters worse, one of the guards chimed in, unable to resist adding his 2 cents. "Still, sir, are you sure you're comfortable staying here? This is a 5-star establishment after all. Maybe somewhere else would be more suitable?" That was the final straw. Chuck had endured enough thinly veiled insults about his appearance, but this comment crossed the line. His patience, usually unshakable, began to wear thin. He straightened up, his towering frame filling the doorway as he looked each man squarely in the eye. "Let me get one thing straight," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I may not look like your typical guest, but I paid for my room just like anyone else. And I'll thank you to treat me with the same respect you'd show anyone else who walks through those doors." The room fell silent. The manager shifted uncomfortably while the guards exchanged nervous glances. They clearly hadn't expected such a composed yet commanding response. For a moment, no one said a word. Then, finally, the manager broke the tension. "Of course, Mr. Norris. Please accept my apologies for any inconvenience. We value all our guests equally, regardless of, well, anything else." He gestured vaguely toward Chuck's boots, clearly unsure how to finish the sentence without digging himself deeper into trouble. Chuck decided to let it go, for now. He gave a slight nod and closed the door, leaving the trio standing outside. As he leaned against the doorframe, he couldn't help but chuckle softly. What had started as a harmless attempt to blend in had spiraled into a bizarre lesson in humility and judgment. Those boots had become more than just footwear. They were a symbol of how quickly people could form opinions based on appearances alone. But even as frustration bubbled beneath the surface, Chuck couldn't deny that this experience was teaching him something valuable. Fame might shield him from certain challenges, but stepping into someone else's shoes, even metaphorically, gave him a glimpse of the struggles ordinary people faced every day. Still, he couldn't wait to see the looks on their faces when they realized exactly who they'd been doubting. After the door clicked shut, Chuck stood in silence for a moment, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. He wasn't angry, not exactly, but he couldn't deny that the situation had left a mark. For years, people had treated him with awe and admiration, often assuming he was larger than life simply because of his name. But tonight, he'd been reduced to feeling like an outsider, judged not by his achievements or character, but by the condition of his boots. It was humbling, frustrating, and oddly enlightening all at once. As he paced around the room, Chuck's thoughts drifted back to the guard's words. Maybe somewhere else would be more suitable. The comment stung, not because it was particularly harsh, but because it highlighted how quick people were to make assumptions based on appearances. Those scuffed-up boots, which he had chosen to help him blend in, had unintentionally become a barrier instead. They weren't just footwear. They represented the divide between how others saw him and who he truly was. But then, a mischievous grin spread across Chuck's face. He realized this little experiment had taken an unexpected turn, one that could either end in embarrassment for him or hilarity for everyone involved. After all, he hadn't come here to cause trouble. He'd come to escape the constant spotlight. Yet now, thanks to the hotel staff's skepticism, he found himself in a position where revealing his identity might actually teach them a valuable lesson about judgment and humility. With that thought in mind, Chuck decided to take matters into his own hands. He stepped back outside his room and walked confidently toward the elevator, heading straight for the lobby. When the doors opened, he spotted the manager near the front desk, still looking flustered as he spoke quietly with the two guards. Chuck approached them without hesitation, his posture relaxed yet commanding. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to draw their attention. The manager turned, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized Chuck. "Yes, Mr. Norris, is everything all right?" Chuck smiled faintly. "I just wanted to clear something up," he began, pausing dramatically for effect. Then leaning in slightly, he added, "You might want to double-check who I am before making assumptions next time." The manager blinked, clearly confused. "What do you mean, sir?" That's when Chuck removed his baseball cap, revealing his unmistakable features. Recognition dawned instantly, spreading across the manager's face like wildfire. His jaw dropped and his clipboard nearly slipped from his grasp. "Oh my goodness," he gasped. You're Chuck Norris." Before the manager could recover, the two guards stepped forward, their expressions morphing from suspicion to sheer disbelief. One of them whispered loudly, "Wait, that's the Chuck Norris? The guy from all those movies?" Chuck nodded, his grin widening as he watched their faces transform from doubt to awe. The manager immediately began apologizing profusely, bowing his head repeatedly as if trying to make up for every skeptical glance they'd given him earlier. "Mr. Norris, please forgive us. We had no idea, we never imagined. You see, we thought—" "It's all right," Chuck interrupted gently, holding up a hand to stop the flood of apologies. "I understand you were just doing your job, but maybe next time, try not to judge someone too quickly. You never know who's standing right in front of you." The lobby fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Guests nearby, sensing something unusual was happening, began gathering around to catch a glimpse of the legendary martial artist. Within moments, whispers erupted throughout the space. "Is that really Chuck Norris? Oh my gosh, it is!" Before long, the entire hotel buzzed with excitement. The manager, desperate to make amends, offered Chuck complimentary upgrades, free meals, and even a personal tour of the hotel's amenities. Chuck accepted graciously, knowing the gesture came from genuine remorse. As word spread, fans lined up to meet him, snapping photos and asking for autographs. What had started as a tense misunderstanding had turned into a heartwarming moment of connection. Later that night, as Chuck returned to his upgraded suite, he reflected on the day's events. Sure, it had been frustrating at times, but it had also been eye-opening and unexpectedly fun. Sometimes life's greatest lessons came wrapped in irony, delivered through a pair of old boots and a lot of misplaced judgment. And for Chuck Norris, that made the story all the more memorable. That evening, after the whirlwind of excitement in the lobby, Chuck found himself sitting alone on the balcony of his upgraded suite. The city lights twinkled below, painting the skyline with a warm glow. For the first time all day, he had a moment to breathe and reflect. The chaos of mistaken identity, judgmental stares, and eventual recognition had left him with a lot to think about. At first glance, the day's events might have seemed like just another funny story to add to his long list of adventures. After all, Chuck Norris was no stranger to being underestimated or surprising people when they least expected it. But this experience felt different. It wasn't just about proving who he was or enjoying the rush of fanfare that followed. Instead, it made him pause and consider how often people were judged not by their actions or intentions, but by superficial details, like a pair of worn-out boots. He thought back to the security guard's skeptical expressions and the manager's awkward apologies. None of them had set out to offend him. They were simply doing their jobs, trying to protect the hotel's reputation. Yet, in their haste to make assumptions, they had almost missed the bigger picture. Chuck knew he could have revealed his identity earlier, cutting the tension and saving everyone some embarrassment. But something stopped him. He wanted to see where the situation would lead, not just for laughs, but because he sensed there was a lesson hidden beneath the surface. As the cool night air brushed against his face, Chuck realized that stepping into someone else's shoes, even briefly, had given him a rare perspective. Fame had shielded him from many everyday struggles, but today, he'd caught a glimpse of what it felt like to be dismissed without a second thought. Those moments of doubt, frustration, and even amusement reminded him of how much power perception held over people's lives. A single glance, a misplaced comment, or an unspoken assumption could shape someone's entire experience. But the day hadn't been without its silver linings. Once the truth came out, the hotel staff had gone above and beyond to make amends. Guests had flocked to meet him, sharing stories of how his movies and stunts had inspired them. Strangers became friends in an instant, united by laughter and shared memories. Even the two security guards who had questioned him earlier approached sheepishly, apologizing again and asking for a photo. Chuck gladly obliged, shaking hands and thanking them for helping turn an awkward encounter into a memorable one. Sitting there under the stars, Chuck couldn't help but smile. Life had a way of teaching lessons in the most unexpected ways. Today, it had used a pair of thrift store boots to remind him, and everyone else involved, that appearances rarely told the whole story. Whether you were a world-famous icon or an ordinary person walking through the doors of a luxury hotel, Everyone deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. Before heading inside, Chuck glanced down at his boots. They were still scuffed, still far from stylish, but now they carried a deeper meaning. To him, they symbolized humility, resilience, and the importance of looking beyond the surface. As he stepped back into his room, he decided to write a note to the hotel management. Not to criticize, but to encourage. He hoped his words would inspire them to treat every guest, no matter how they looked or dressed, with the dignity and warmth they deserved. Little did Chuck know, this simple act of reflection would leave a lasting impression on the hotel staff and on himself. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows of his suite, Chuck sat at the small desk near the balcony. In front of him was a blank piece of hotel stationery and a pen. He had spent much of the previous night thinking about what to say, not just to express gratitude for their eventual hospitality, but also to share the lesson he'd taken away from the experience. Writing wasn't something Chuck did often, especially not in such a personal way, but this felt important. If his words could help shift someone's perspective, even slightly, it would be worth it. He began by thanking the manager and the staff for their kindness after the mix-up. "I truly appreciate your efforts to make me feel welcome," he wrote, keeping his tone warm and genuine. Then he paused, tapping the pen against the paper as he carefully chose his next words. This was the tricky part. He didn't want to come across as lecturing or critical. Instead, he wanted to frame the situation as a learning opportunity, both for himself and for them. Chuck continued, "Yesterday reminded me of something we all sometimes forget, how quick we can be to judge others based on appearances. When I walked into your hotel wearing my old boots and casual clothes, I saw firsthand how easy it is to form opinions without knowing the full story. It happens everywhere, in hotels, restaurants, workplaces, and even in our daily interactions with strangers." He paused again, glancing down at the boots sitting neatly by the door. They were still scuffed, still far from polished, but now they carried a deeper significance. To Chuck, they represented more than just an undercover disguise. They symbolized the power of assumptions and the importance of looking beyond surface-level details. He leaned back over the paper and added, "Those boots taught me that stepping into someone else's shoes, literally or figuratively, can open your eyes to experiences you might otherwise overlook." To drive the point home, Chuck decided to include a touch of humor. After all, if there was one thing people loved about him, it was his ability to find levity in any situation. "For the record," he wrote with a grin, "those boots may not look fancy, but they've been around the block a few times. They've seen action, adventure, and maybe even a roundhouse kick or two." He chuckled softly to himself as he imagined the staff reading that line. Humor, he knew, could soften even the toughest conversations. Finally, he ended the note with a heartfelt message. "Thank you again for treating me with respect and generosity once everything was cleared up. My hope is that every guest who walks through your doors, whether they're wearing designer shoes or work boots, feels valued and respected from the moment they arrive. Because in the end, it's not what we wear or how we look that defines us, it's how we treat each other." When he finished writing, Chuck folded the note neatly and placed it inside an envelope. Then he grabbed the boots, the very ones that had sparked this entire adventure, and scribbled a short inscription on the side. "Never judge a book by its cover or its boots." With a satisfied nod, he left the boots and the note at the front desk before checking out, quietly slipping away without drawing attention. Later that day, the hotel manager found the gift and read Chuck's words. At first, he smiled at the cleverness of the inscription, but as he absorbed the deeper meaning behind the message, his expression softened. The staff gathered around, passing the note and the boots between them, each person reflecting on the encounter and the lessons it held. From that day forward, the story of Chuck Norris and his boots became a legend within the hotel, a reminder to treat every guest with dignity, no matter what they wore or how they looked. As Chuck drove away from the hotel, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. What had started as a simple attempt to blend in had turned into something much bigger, an opportunity to inspire change, one step at a time. Weeks after Chuck Norris checked out of the hotel, life in the bustling Los Angeles establishment returned to its usual rhythm. Guests came and went. Bellhops rushed to assist with luggage, and the concierge desk buzzed with inquiries about local attractions. But something had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. The staff who had been part of the boot incident found themselves approaching their work with a renewed sense of awareness. Conversations among employees often circled back to that unforgettable day when Chuck Norris himself had walked through their doors, leaving behind not just autographs, but also a lasting impression. The manager kept the scuffed-up boots on display in a glass case near the front desk, accompanied by a plaque bearing Chuck's inscription, "Never judge a book by its cover or its boots." It became a conversation starter for guests, many of whom marveled at the story behind it. Some laughed at the irony of judging someone like Chuck Norris, while others nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the deeper message embedded in the tale. Over time, the boots transformed from a quirky keepsake into a symbol of humility and respect, a constant reminder to see beyond appearances. For the two security guards involved in the initial misunderstanding, the experience proved particularly transformative. At first, they had felt embarrassed, even mortified by their role in questioning such a legendary figure. But as days passed, they began to view the incident differently, not as a mistake to be ashamed of, but as a lesson learned. They started paying closer attention to how they interacted with guests, focusing less on outward appearances and more on making everyone feel welcome. One of them later admitted during a team meeting, "If we can treat every guest like they're Chuck Norris, this place will be better for it." Word of the story spread beyond the hotel walls, thanks in part to social media posts from guests who had witnessed the event or heard about it afterward. Photos of the boots and the plaque went viral, sparking discussions online about judgment, empathy, and the value of looking past first impressions. People shared their own stories of being misjudged or misunderstood, creating a ripple effect of reflection and understanding. For many, Chuck's simple act of leaving those boots behind served as a powerful metaphor. Sometimes the smallest gestures can carry the biggest lessons. As for Chuck, he returned home with a newfound appreciation for the complexities of human interaction. His undercover experiment had given him a glimpse into the challenges faced by ordinary people every day, challenges he rarely encountered due to his fame. It reinforced his belief in treating others with kindness and fairness, no matter who they were or what they looked like. He often smiled whenever he thought about the hotel staff's reactions when they realized who he was, the shock, the apologies, the eventual warmth. It reminded him that humor and humility could bridge even the widest gaps. Months later, Chuck received a letter from the hotel management. Inside was a heartfelt note thanking him once again for his visit and sharing how his actions had inspired positive changes within the staff. Enclosed with the letter was a photograph of the boots in their display case, surrounded by smiling employees. "Your gift continues to remind us daily of the importance of treating everyone with dignity," the note read. "We hope you know how much your presence and your wisdom meant to us." Chuck tucked the photo and letter into a drawer, where he kept mementos of meaningful moments. Though he never sought recognition for his gesture, he felt grateful, knowing it had made an impact. Life, he realized, was full of opportunities to teach and learn, to inspire change in ways both big and small. And sometimes all it took was a pair of old boots to leave a legacy of compassion and understanding. Years later, the hotel still proudly displayed the boots, and the story remained a cherished part of its history. Guests continued to share it, with friends and family, ensuring that its message endured. For Chuck Norris, it was proof that even the simplest acts of humanity could resonate far beyond what anyone might expect. After all, true strength wasn't measured by physical prowess or fame. It was found in the ability to connect, to uplift, and to remind others of their worth.